Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we will be looking in some detail at the National Infrastructure Commission's recently released second National Infrastructure Assessment. As I'm sure you will know, the National Infrastructure Commission's role is to provide the UK government with impartial expert advice on long-term infrastructure challenges. Its first five-yearly National Infrastructure Assessment was published in 2018 and was something of a seminal moment, signalling for the first time a new long-term approach to planning the UK's infrastructure needs. 5 years on, and this year's assessment focuses on a number of strategic priorities, not least the need to reach net zero by 2050 by decarbonising electricity, transport, industry and the way we heat our homes. It also prioritises the need to reduce environmental impacts from our infrastructure and ensure that we're ready to adapt to a changing climate, particularly a drier climate with more pressure on our water supplies and, as we're seeing again right now, more risk of flooding. And it is, of course, supports the ongoing agenda to level up the UK economy and create sustainable economic growth across all regions of the UK. But, as Sir John Armitt, Chair of the Commission, says in his intro, the hardest part is turning policy into delivery on the ground. And he adds, what our infrastructure needs now is the collective mettle to turn commitments into action that will reap rewards for decades to come. So, certainly lots to discuss there, not least in light of the recent snap decision by the Prime Minister to cancel the northern leg of the vast, strategically important HS2 project. To discuss this, it's my pleasure to welcome James Heath, Chief Executive of the National Infrastructure Commission, and as a person who's navigated difficult ground over the last few years to pull together this report, his view on these priorities will, I'm sure, be insightful. James, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thanks, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, James, let's start where your report starts and build on Sir John's comments by talking about the reality that the UK can have the low-carbon infrastructure that supports economic growth and protects the natural environment, but only if government is willing, as you say, to make bold decisions, plan for the long term and support households through the transition. So are you seeing more or less sign that those bold decisions are coming from our government today?
Yes and no. We've seen government set ambitious targets in areas like net zero, and we've seen significant progress in areas like increasing the share of electricity generated by renewables. But in many other areas, these goals are not yet being matched by policies and plans of sufficient scale to turn the dial. And also we're not seeing that rapid delivery on the ground. So how we decarbonise our buildings, probably the single biggest net zero challenge is one example of that. The reform of our planning system so we get critical infrastructure projects built is another example. So this is why in the assessment we called for pace, not perfection, in how we make infrastructure decisions, because the sort of cost of delay is now greater than the risk of making some suboptimal decisions.
Okay. I mean, we'll come on to that pace not perfection comment a bit later on, but you also say the UK needs to invest in its future, and now is the time to act. I have to mention the HS2 decision. I mean, the Commission has been critical of the latest decision to cancel HS2 North, and why government insists that it's simply a pragmatic repurposing of £36 billion of investment. To many, this decision is emblematic of the stop-start approach to infrastructure investment, which is the thing that's holding us back. I mean, what is your view on that?
So perhaps we'll come to HS2 in a moment. It's on this general point. I think, yes, in recent years we have seen too much chopping and changing around infrastructure policy, and this does create uncertainty for infrastructure operators and investors, which can deter investment. It also can slow the development of supply chains and sort of drive up costs. Just to give two good examples of this in the contrast. On the one hand, you've seen the impact of the sort of stop-start approach to energy efficiency in the UK, which has led to low rates of installations over the past decade. And on the other, you've seen how policy stability has created through the contracts for difference mechanism, has supported the rapid deployment of renewables. So I think those two examples give you a sense of how important policy stability is and how difficult sort of a stop-start approach can be for infrastructure, because infrastructure is by definition long-term, it's expensive, and therefore it is vulnerable to changes in policy regimes.
So on that basis, halting the HS2 investment, it undermines surely what you're trying to achieve.
I mean, the point we were making in the document, in the report on HS2, was that, I mean, clearly the government's decision happened very late in the day when it came to the planning assumptions we used in formulating our assessment. And what's happened is the government has replaced its long-term strategy for rail, including High Speed 2, going from Birmingham to Manchester, with a collection of rail projects at various stages of maturity. Yeah. And our advice to government is that it now needs to work with local leaders to turn this collection of schemes into a rigorously costed portfolio of rail improvements with clear delivery timetables designed to address what are long-standing capacity and connectivity challenges facing the North and the Midlands. Yeah. And we are ready to help government do that.
This is this comprehensive, long-term, fully costed plan that you talk about. And I suppose, do you think that really will achieve the desired outcome, particularly if the protected land is sold?
So specifically on the land issue, I mean, commissioners have been clear that they think it would make sense to keep options open and pause any land sales while we consider how best to connect Birmingham and Manchester and provide the improved connectivity that will be needed, particularly given the pressures on the West Coast main line. So I think, look, we've got a collection of schemes in the government's plan around Network North. I think how we translate those into a fully costed, coherent and integrated strategy is now the challenge facing us.
Yeah, I suppose the point is the decision's been made. We've got to look positively about how we deal with that going forward. So let's talk about your recommendations. I mean, you've got quite a few core recommendations. Let's start with adding low carbon flexible technologies to the electricity system to ensure supply remains reliable and secure. I mean, does that mean investing in wind and solar, or are we talking about lots of new nuclear?
Look, I think it means that within the next 12 years, by 2035, the UK needs a reliable electricity system running mostly on renewable power. So for us, that's a mix of offshore wind, onshore wind and solar power. But critically, these renewables need to be complemented by more flexible technologies that can generate if the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And these technologies are sort of divided, if you like, into short-term flexibility, i.e. balancing the grid within a day, so things like interconnectors, batteries, demand-side response, and then long-term flexibility where supply needs to be topped up over days or weeks. And in our view, that long-term flexibility, which I think is a really hard part, needs to be provided by electricity generated by hydrogen and gas with carbon capture and storage. And the report does set out the sort of volumes of flexibility we think we'll need by 2035 and the business models that will be needed to pull through those technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose on the other end of the scale, you also talk about the clear decision that electrification is the only viable option for decarbonising buildings. You talk about fully covering the costs of installing heat pumps for lower income households and offering 7,000 support to all others. That's all about getting, I suppose, the population to embrace this kind of new thinking. But is it realistic? It's going to come with quite a large bill, and I'm not sure we've got the skills and capacity to do that.
Look, I think ending Britain's dependence on gas for heating is probably the single biggest net zero challenge we face. But it's necessary that we do it, and our view is that it's achievable as long as we have a plan in place. And yeah, I think as you said, our view is that the answer for the vast majority of homes will be heat pumps. They are a highly efficient way of converting electricity to heat, but alongside other forms of electric heating like sort of heat networks as well. I think the government's own analysis suggests that around 9 in 10 homes have sufficient insulation and power supply for heat pumps to work effectively. So our report sets out, if you like, a long-term, fully funded plan to shift the dial on installation and build up those supply chains in heat pumps. I mean, it would see lower-income households receive a full subsidy for a heat pump, and then other households would be offered £7,000 contribution to the upfront cost plus government-backed zero-cost financing. And we're very upfront about the scale of such a programme. It would cost the public purse about £6 billion a year between now and the 2030s. That's about, to put it in context, that's about 15% of the total public investment we're recommending in infrastructure. But critically, we should remember that helping households with the impact of the gas price shock over the last 2 years has cost well over £30 billion. and moving to sort of
yeah.
heating powered by low carbon electricity would protect us from those shocks going forward. And it would also get household energy bills coming down over time because we'll be using much more efficient heating systems.
Yeah. You have demonstrated in the past that things, it is possible to turn big things around. I mean, one of the things you talk about is ensuring gigabit capable broadband is available nationwide by 2030 and ensuring the rollout of 5G. I mean, this is one of the success stories in many ways. I mean, why has this been so deliverable?
Yeah, I think it is one of the success stories, and I don't just say that because I was involved in developing strategy in advising ministers in my previous job in government. But look, the availability of gigabit-capable broadband has increased from around 75% of the UK, up from about 5% in 2018. And I think the key reason, or certainly one of the key reasons that has happened, is because of the alignment between government and the regulator, both on the goal of nationwide gigabit-capable networks, but also on the competition model, the network competition model, and the investment incentives to achieve it. And I think it was that stability of policy alongside the regulator Ofcom's regulatory settlement that allowed sort of pricing flexibility for fibre services, helped create the market confidence, which has contributed to that significant increase in private sector investment and the rapid delivery that we've seen. And it's interesting for me as I reflect on that, in terms of how we can replicate that sort of policy and regulatory model in other infrastructure sectors.
Well, it's interesting you say that because you switch now to the one of the next recommendations, preparing for a drier future by putting plans in place to deliver additional water supply, reduce leakage while also reducing water demand. The reality is the water sector is in a mess. The regulation, it hasn't really been working in the way it was intended. We haven't built a new reservoir in the UK for decades. I mean, how is it going to be possible? Does this require fundamental reform of this whole regulated industry?
I think we are definitely going to need to see a sustained programme of investment in the water sector going forward. I mean, for us, there's two big challenges. There's a challenge around water security and dealing with drought risk, a growing challenge, particularly in parts of the country, as we saw only a few summers ago. So how do we put the infrastructure in place to meet those water resource needs going forward? And then alongside that, you've got a set of challenges in the wastewater network side around how you deal with some of the pollution challenges we've seen, the combined sewer overflow issues that we've seen. And you put those two challenges together, and in order to fix them, you are going to need sustained investment. And I think one of the problems we've got in the water sector is that we've had a period of underinvestment. We've had a period where water bills have effectively been flat in real terms for about the last 10 years. And I think now we are seeing some of the issues that flow from that. But I think if we're going to convince the public that there needs to be sustained increase in investment and that bills are going to have to go up, I think the water companies are going to have to demonstrate clear and rapid change and improvement in terms of the services they provide in order to rebuild trust in the sector. But I agree, I think the sector is facing some major challenges, and it's gone from being a fairly predictable, boring sector with fairly predictable rates of return to a sector now facing much greater set of risks, much greater political scrutiny. And I think that will pose some challenges in terms of how we get an investment into the sector and the rates of return we're offering.
Yeah, because you also set out some issues around flooding, setting long-term measurable targets, to ensure that the significantly reduce the number of properties that are at risk from flooding. Without seeming cynical, we've been talking about this flooding challenge for probably the last 3 decades or more. The problem probably is who owns the problem. So who do you think owns that problem?
I think it probably depends what type of flooding we're talking about. I think in terms of sort of river and coastal flooding, some of the challenges we're seeing at the moment, I think we're in a better place now in terms of we've got long-term 5-year funding cycles there for that type of funding. Something that we called for in the first National Infrastructure Assessment back in 2018. So I think we've got a framework there for how we are dealing with those challenges. The challenges are significant. They're growing, obviously, with climate change. but at least we've got a framework thinking about them. I think the area where we're much further behind is sort of flash flooding or sort of surface water flooding, very localised flooding issues, i.e. the type of thing we saw in London several years ago with those sort of flash floods. And I think there we don't yet have a proper strategy in place. We don't yet have a proper funding model in place. And actually the ownership of surface water and flash flooding needs to be at the local level, and there needs to be much stronger coordination and planning between water companies and local authorities, local flood agencies, in order to identify the risk areas, develop coherent plans to deal with those problems and set clear targets so we can see whether we're sort of winning or losing in terms of success. So I actually think that surface water flooding has been the sort of Cinderella sector of flooding. There's actually more properties at risk from surface water flooding than there are river and coastal, but yet we're further behind in terms of having a coherent long-term funded strategy.
It's a huge challenge, that's for sure. So if you can sort that one out, James, then you'll be doing well. Let's talk a bit about you. You've been Chief Executive of the National Infrastructure Commission for the last 3.5 years. Before that, you spent 3 years as Digital Infrastructure Director at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. What drew you from digital infrastructure to economic and social infrastructure?
I think it was mainly an opportunity to work on a wider canvas. To go from thinking quite deeply about one infrastructure sector, digital and broadband, to how we solve sort of problems across, if you like, 6 sectors across economic infrastructure, and seeing that infrastructure, economic infrastructure, is sort of key to dealing with some of the biggest challenges facing the country today. If you take net zero, I think about 2/3 of carbon emissions in the UK come from economic infrastructure. Or if you look at economic growth and how we try and change the economic geography of the UK, I think infrastructure, particularly transport, but also digital, can play a big role in that. So, it was seeing the challenge and opportunity to sort of work across that wide canvas of economic infrastructure that sort of drew me and attracted me to come into the NIC.
Well, you're now working with a phenomenal group of people. That must be inspiring every single part of the day. So, but of course, the first part of your career was spent in media, and public affairs and ITV, and then at the BBC, where you were leading editorial strategy and most recently the director of policy. I mean, that seems quite a stretch, setting strategy for journalists and setting strategy for infrastructure professionals. Where are the similarities? What have you taken from role to role?
So you're right. My last job before I came into government, before I went into DCMS, was leading on public policy for the BBC and actually negotiating the last Royal Charter for the BBC and its last licence fee settlement. So I did spend quite a lot of time engaging with government and the media regulator. So actually, it was quite a natural transition into government because at the BBC, like people like me who worked on the corporate side doing sort of policy and regulation were sort of part of the overhead, whereas the core business of the BBC was making TV and radio programmes. Whereas you move into government, and actually the core function is doing public policy. So actually, government was quite a natural home for me, given my background.
Well, the commissioners you work with, as I say, they're all highly motivated, highly knowledgeable, highly opinionated folk. I mean, what are the greatest challenges in your role right now? I mean, are they hard to manage? What's your strategy for staying on track in meetings, for instance?
I think the key is focus. We have there's a rather large gap between the scale of our remit, as I said, across 6 economic infrastructures, and our available resource. And when you have lots of clever people who want to answer all the questions, I think one of the key tricks is how we really zone in and focus on a set of things where the Commission can add real value, where we can go deep, really look at some of the hardest questions, challenge public policy, and then come up with some big and bold ideas. And you can't do that if you're trying to solve every question, which obviously highly knowledgeable people obviously want to try and sort of look at everything at the same time. So one of my challenges of a CEO, if you like, is sort of trying to make sure that we do stay focused on a targeted number of things where we can really make a difference.
You're not trying to bore the ocean, I suppose. That's the that's it there. Let's look at some eye-catching issues in the report. Just a quick brief romp through those. You mentioned the need to accelerate the use of electric vehicles, invest in charging networks reaching at least 300,000 chargers across the UK by 2030. I mean, are you talking about lampposts, fast, rapid, ultra-fast chargers? Where are you on that spectrum? What do we need?
It would be a mix. I think we need a comprehensive public charging network, which will be a mix of different types of chargers for different use cases. But I think this is where if you like, one of the main areas to focus is. I think there's around 8 million households in the UK who actually park their cars on the street, and therefore, what is the charging infrastructure for those households and those car drivers, I think is really critical, and how we roll it out at the pace we need to reassure drivers around sort of range anxiety, and therefore sort of pull through the sort of demand for vehicles. I mean, we're making reasonable progress in the UK, but we've got to get to that 300,000 charge points by 2030. We're going to need to see a compound annual growth rate in chargers, I think, of over 30% a year. And obviously, as you make progress, that number is going to get bigger and bigger. So I think you're looking at around, by about 2029, you're looking at about 80,000 chargers being established in that year. That's much, much greater than our run rate at the moment. So I think as a sustained challenge here over the next sort of 5-6 years to get where we need to be.
And I suppose that's unravelling the planning nightmare of getting these installations in, but also the power availability problem.
Yeah. I think there's a set of questions there. I mean, Ofgem have made some progress in terms of socialising the cost of the infrastructure to make it easier to deploy. But as you say, there's a set of questions around the connection speeds to the distribution grid. And I think we're expecting government and Ofgem to publish some new proposals on that shortly, but also the sort of planning regime. And that's why I think local authorities play a critical role here in unlocking the investment in this charging network. They control lots of the street furniture, lots of the assets. They understand the needs of their areas, and therefore local authorities playing quite a proactive role in how we roll out public charging infrastructure, I think is going to be really quite important.
Okay. Other issues. I mean, the Commission recommends we talked about the need to invest 3 to 12 billion a year to support households to decarbonise their heating systems. I mean, one of the issues is lack of insulation. I mean, should that be a focus ahead of heat pumps, for instance?
I think we need to do both together. I think we need to have a strategy for heat pumps, but also we need to look how we roll out energy efficiency. I mean, energy efficiency obviously important in terms of bringing bills down, but also in terms of, in certain properties, making heat pumps work more optimally. So I think we've got to do sort of both together. I think that, if you like, the delivery models and energy efficiency need to be looked at. I think we need to see quite a strong role for local authorities driving and coordinating the push on energy efficiency and retrofit in their areas, and therefore how we allocate the money in a more streamlined, consolidated way, I think is quite important. So for me, it's both together rather than a sort of, if you like, fabric first model before we can move on heat pumps. So I don't think we have the time to do that, and I think increasingly the evidence is suggesting that you don't necessarily need that sort of fabric first approach in lots of properties in order for heat pumps to work optimally.
Okay. Just as we move to the end, talking about some of your recommendations for delivery. I mean, one of the things you talk about, government must be able to make good decisions fast. One of your recommendations is around removing barriers and accelerating decisions. Currently there are too many barriers that slow down infrastructure decision making and makes the UK a less attractive place to invest. I mean, how can this policy change really be speeded up?
I think one key example is the planning regime, the consenting regime for infrastructure. At the moment, I think it is probably, if not the single biggest, it's one of the biggest constraints on our ability to meet net zero, is the sort of the pace of the planning system for major infrastructure projects, particularly on the energy transmission infrastructure side. And the Commission have made a set of proposals for how we can speed up that process. I mean, I think we need to be realistic. Back in 2010, the average time to consent a major piece of infrastructure was around 2 years. It's now over 4.5 years. And I think we can get back to where we were in 2010. That feels realistic and credible. And we've set out a set of proposals for doing that, which we hope the government will adopt. But I think, sorting out the planning system in the UK for infrastructure is one of the key ways in which we are going to speed up the deployment of infrastructure and pull down the sort of cost of that infrastructure and create greater certainty in the market.
And you referred to something called adaptive planning, dealing with uncertainty in long-term infrastructure policy. I mean, how do you describe it, adaptive planning?
I think that is obviously a way of sort of dealing with the level of uncertainty that we face in infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure is almost by definition long-term, and therefore there's a lot of uncertainty in how you pursue it. At the same time, that uncertainty can't paralyse you. You can't, if you like, stand still in the face of that uncertainty. We've got to carry on moving forward and make these planning decisions. And therefore, how you think about uncertainty in making infrastructure policy, I think is quite key. And I suppose to bring it to life, an example of this is how we do sort of rail strategy in the UK, and some proposals we've made in the past about trying to identify sort of core sets of proposals where you're clear, if you like, on the aims and the objectives and the benefits, and you're clear on the costs. You've narrowed those costs down, and therefore you can move forward and then build on that with further enhancements to the network as and when those costs and those benefits are sort of revealing themselves. It's how the French rolled out sort of high-speed rail. Their model of running a high-speed rail was to move sort of line by line, and only when they understood the benefits and the costs of doing one intervention did they then move on to the next intervention. And I think learning some of those lessons in terms of how we do rail in the UK is quite important, rather than lapsing into a model whereby we make big promises and then sort of repent at leisure once the reality of the costs and the benefits hit us. I think we just need to be a bit clever and more systematic in how we take account of uncertainty in sort of infrastructure planning.
Well, of course, uncertainty is quite often driven by the politics of infrastructure. And when I spoke to Sir John Armitt earlier in the year on the podcast, he reminded me that infrastructure is umbilically linked to politics. It can't be separated. But you're independent. I mean, how do you navigate the politics of infrastructure at the Commission?
Yeah, I think, look, I don't think you can or indeed should try and take politics out of infrastructure. I mean, elected politicians, I think, should rightly shape the strategic objectives around infrastructure, because I suppose, after all, transport and energy and digital are means to an end, whether that's economic growth or net zero. However, I think we do need to get better at making infrastructure decisions in the UK. And I think with the sort of, if you like, with the power of office comes that responsibility to face up to challenges that sit well beyond any given electoral cycle. And having sort of ambitious goals is not enough. We've got to be prepared to make some hard choices, whether that's reforming the planning system or some of the other issues I talked about today. And I think institutions like the Commission exist to advise government, but also to try and build consensus across parties, across stakeholders, so we try and create a more stable sort of policy environment for industry and investors that can try and help with us making sort of longer term decisions and decisions that we stick to, while accepting that you can't and you shouldn't take the politics out of infrastructure. I think we just need to get better at how we make infrastructure decisions.
Yeah. Well, as I said at the start, the first assessment was a seminal moment, actually getting this long-term planning. This next latest report it's a powerful document. I suppose what happens next? You've set out this plan. Going back to my references to John's opening, the hardest part is turning policy into delivery on the ground. So how do you do that? What has to happen next to turn these great ideas into policy and then deliverables?
So the next stage will be for government to consider our report, our recommendations, our analysis. Government then has between sort of six months to a year to sort of formulate its response to those recommendations and give a view on those it wants to take forward and those that it doesn't. And we'll obviously now be engaging with government to make sure it fully understands what we're saying, fully understands the analysis and the evidence behind the recommendations, and we hope to see a positive response from government in sort of policy terms as soon as possible. And I think that then becomes the next stage.
Okay. Well, we look forward to seeing how it all comes out in the wash, so to speak, and whether it survives the next round of general elections. Who knows? James, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for spending time with me on the Infrastructure Podcast today. Really, really interesting discussion. Really interesting time for infrastructure, and I hope that this conversation has brought some clarity to what is a complex plan. As you say, delivery is crucial, and we'll see what happens. So, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Anthony. It's been great.
Thanks, James. That's all we've got time for today, but we've got more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website. It's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So, thanks for joining us, and thanks again to James. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.